In 1941, one factory in Toledo, Ohio was producing one Jeep every 80 seconds. Every minute and 20 seconds, a new vehicle rolled off the line destined for the battlefields of the Second World War. Every single day, without stopping. Walk into the Willys-Overland plant on Jeep Parkway in those years and the heat alone would hit you first. The smell of hot metal and engine oil. Row after row of workers, men and women. You had nearly 15,000 of them, moving in a relentless rhythm across a campus of 60 buildings stretching across 6 million square feet of floor space. Machines never sleeping, engines never cooling, a factory that never, ever stopped. By 1942, Willys-Overland controlled the most important military vehicle contract in American history. 362,841 Jeeps would be built here before the war was over. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. And Willys-Overland built the heart of it. But here's the truth that history buries. Long before that factory fell silent, long before the smokestacks went cold and the wrecking ball came in 2002, a series of catastrophic decisions had already been made. Decisions by the man who built it. Decisions by the bankers who controlled it. Decisions by the corporations that consumed it. One after another, each one tightening the noose. What does it mean when the company that helped win a world war cannot survive peacetime? When the creator of an icon does not get to keep it? This is the story of Willys-Overland. Its furious rise from a bankrupt bicycle dealer's dream. Its breathtaking peak as the second-largest car maker in America. And the long, grinding series of decisions, some reckless, some cowardly, some simply tragic, that ended the original Jeep factory forever. Welcome inside the Toledo plant on Jeep Parkway, where the vehicle that won a war could not save the company that built it. 1907, Indianapolis, Indiana. John North Willys stepped off a train with a problem. He was 34 years old, built like a man who had never needed anyone to settle his disputes, and he was angry. Weeks earlier, from his dealership in Elmira, New York, he had placed a $10,000 order for 500 Overland automobiles. Not one had arrived. Not one telegram had been answered. What he found when he walked into the Overland factory was a nightmare. The floor was covered in partially assembled vehicles. Workers stood idle. The machinery had gone quiet. The company's backer, a carriage manufacturer named David Perry, had been wiped out by the panic of 1907. The factory was functionally dead. The owner, Claude Cox, was sitting in the wreckage of a business that owed money in every direction. As Willys could have walked away. He had lost $10,000 and had every right to call it a catastrophic lesson and move on. Instead, he did something that would define the next 4 decades of American industrial history. He asked what it would take to revive the place. He was told that debts had to be settled and suppliers had to be paid. He petitioned the bankruptcy court, acquired controlling interest for the price of his original $10,000 investment, and within weeks had negotiated settlements with creditors, restarted production, and began rebuilding the dealer network that would carry overland cars across the country. John North Willys was not an engineer. He was not a manufacturer. He was a salesman. Born in Canandaigua, New York, in October 1873, who had begun his career selling bicycles and discovered that what made him extraordinary was not the product. It was his ability to convince people they needed it. So he had sold 20 cars in 1903 from a modest dealership. By 1906, he was selling the entire annual output of 2 factories. He did not build things. He built demand so overwhelming that factories could not keep pace. By 1909, he had moved all production to Toledo, Ohio, into the massive facilities of the bankrupt Pope Motor Car Company, a factory he acquired for next to nothing. Then he expanded it. Then he expanded it again. The problem was that John Willys confused unstoppable momentum for permanent safety. He was accelerating, and nobody around him had the power or the courage to tell him to slow down. What came next was not a triumph. It was the first sign of a pattern that would haunt this company for half a century. 1912. Toledo, Ohio. The factory campus on the banks of the Ottawa River had become something Toledo had never seen before. Building after building, chimney after chimney. Yet the three great brick smokestacks with the name Overland, embedded in black brick, had become a landmark visible for miles, a monument to the industrial ambition of one man who had arrived in this city just 4 years earlier. In 1912, the renamed Willys-Overland Motor Company achieved what almost no manufacturer in America could claim. It became the second largest automaker in the United States behind Ford. Not third, not fourth, second. But for 6 consecutive years, from 1912 to 1918, Willys held that position. The first Toledo-built model, the Overland Model 38, sold nearly 16,000 units in 1910 alone. By 1912, sales had doubled to 32,000. By 1916, Willys was producing 143,000 vehicles annually. Nearly 10% of every car sold in America that year. The factory employed 18,000 workers in Toledo and another 20,000 across facilities in Elyria, Ohio, Flint and Pontiac, Michigan, and Buffalo, New York. 1/3 of Toledo's entire workforce was employed either directly at Willys-Overland or at one of the dozens of supplier businesses that had grown up around the factory. The city was, in every meaningful sense, a company town. John Willys was not done. He acquired the license to build Charles Yale Knight's sleeve valve engine in 1913, launching the Willys Knight nameplate that would appeal to buyers who wanted something more refined. He purchased Electric Auto Light in 1914. He formed the Willys Corporation as a holding company in 1917 to coordinate his sprawling empire. He acquired interests in Duesenberg, Curtiss Aeroplane, the Moline Plow Company, rubber firms, and gear manufacturers. He was building not a car company, but an industrial civilization. The market capitalization of Willys-Overland reached $75 million by the mid-1910s. The administration building, completed in 1915, 7 stories of limestone and brick, was the most modern office complex in Toledo. Then something happened. Something that John Willys could not build his way out of, buy his way around, or sell his way past. He moved to New York City. It was a decision he almost certainly did not think twice about. After all, the empire was running. The machines were humming. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. 1919, Toledo, Ohio. The production floor of the Willys plant had changed since John Willys had last walked it regularly. Not physically, the machines were the same, the rows of assembly stations stretched just as far. But something invisible had gone. The workers knew it. Management knew it. Willys himself. And now, operating from his office in New York, could not see it because he was no longer there to see anything. He had put a man named Clarence Earl in charge of the Toledo operation. Earl ran the factory the way a general runs a conquered city, with authority, distance, and a complete indifference to the people producing his results. Where Willys had been famous for walking the factory floor in shirt sleeves, putting in 14-hour days alongside the men who built his cars, here Earl issued orders from above and treated the workforce as machinery to be managed rather than people to be respected. Labor relations turned corrosive almost immediately. By 1919, the tension had ignited. A strike erupted across the Toledo plant, violent enough that federal courts had to intervene, and the governor of Ohio threatened to activate the National Guard. The factory shut down for months, not weeks, months. In a year when American automobile production rose 48% nationally, Willys-Overland output collapsed by 26%. The timing could not have been worse. A severe post-war recession began hammering the American economy Just as Willys was hemorrhaging production, the overextended Willys Corporation, with its web of acquired companies, its debt obligations, its sprawling facilities, found itself suddenly, catastrophically exposed. Creditors, who had watched nervously as Willys accumulated liabilities across a dozen industries, moved fast. They did not ask John Willys to fix the problem. They hired someone else to do it. In 1920, the bankers brought in Walter Percy Chrysler, the former vice president of General Motors' Buick division. Chrysler demanded an annual salary of $1 million, equivalent to nearly $19 million today, regardless of outcome. The bankers accepted without hesitation. Chrysler cut assets. He sold off plants. He reduced the Willys debt from $48 million to $18 million over 2 years. Then he attempted to take the company for himself, engineering a stock maneuver designed to oust Willys entirely. The workforce, loyal to the man who built it, not the man who rescued it, rejected Chrysler decisively. Chrysler walked away. He went to Maxwell Chalmers and eventually built his own company. John Willys got his company back. But the empire was smaller, and the pattern had been established. The company that could not survive its founder's absence would be tested again and again and again. 1926, Toledo, Ohio. John North Willys had done it again. Against every reasonable expectation, he had rebuilt his company from the wreckage of receivership and positioned Willys-Overland to compete at the highest level of the American automobile market. By 1925, while production had climbed back to 150,000 cars annually, the Willys Nightline, with its distinctive sleeve valve engine, had become a profitable prestige product. Then came the Whippet. Introduced in 1926, the Overland Whippet was everything the American middle-class buyer of the mid-20s wanted in a small car. Light, affordable, well-made, nimble enough for city streets and sturdy enough for country roads. Sales immediately accelerated. By 1928, Whippet production had passed 300,000 units in a single year, and Willys had vaulted to third place in American automobile sales. Behind only Ford and Chevrolet, not fourth, not fifth, third. The company that had nearly dissolved twice was now one of the 3 most powerful automakers on earth. It is worth pausing here to understand what this meant for Toledo. The factory on Jeep Parkway was expanding again. Buildings were added. Workers were hired. The administration building that John Willys had declared a symbol that Willys-Overland is in Toledo to stay was surrounded by a growing constellation of production and assembly facilities. A city that had watched its great company nearly die twice was now watching it surge back to a dominance it had not achieved since the years before the strike of 1919. But here is what nobody saw coming. The Whippet's greatest virtue was also its fatal flaw. It was light. Too light. The owners drove it hard, because a light car with a strong motor invites exactly that kind of use. And when the cars were driven hard, they wore out fast, faster than competitors. The Whippet earned a reputation, unfair perhaps, but devastating, for brittleness. By 1929, that reputation was costing sales even before the stock market collapse had taken the rest. John Willys, in the middle of 1929, did something remarkable. He sold all of his common shares in Willys-Overland for a reported $25 million and quietly stepped away from the presidency. President Hoover appointed him ambassador to Poland. Within months, the Great Depression arrived. The man who had built the empire twice was gone, and there was nobody left who could build it a third time. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Yeah, it really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. There's so much more to come, including the moment one small government vehicle would change everything. Don't go anywhere. 1932, Toledo, Ohio. The production floor that had hummed with the sound of Whippets being assembled was now partially silent, not completely, The bankruptcy courts had agreed to allow limited production when orders existed. But the rhythm was broken, the workforce gutted, the orders thin. In 1934, the entire Willys-Overland Motor Company managed to produce just 6,600 cars. That was the total output for the year. Not a week, not a month, the whole year. The Depression had not merely slowed Willys-Overland. It had nearly stopped it entirely. The Stearns Knight luxury brand was liquidated in 1929. The Whippet line was discontinued in 1931. The Willys Knight, the premium sleeve valve car that had made the company a prestige name among buyers of means, ended production in 1933. Brand after brand canceled. Ward M. Canaday, who had joined the company doing advertising work as far back as 1916 and had worked his way to a full-time executive role, took the chairmanship in 1932 and began guiding the company through receivership. His approach was surgical and unsparing. Sell what must be sold, consolidate what must be consolidated, survive. The Canadian subsidiary went. Plant after plant along Central Avenue was sold off to a new holding company. Only the main Toledo assembly facility and a handful of smaller factories remained in Willys' direct ownership. Into this devastation returned John North Willys himself. He came back from Poland, resigned from his diplomatic post, and in a final act of loyalty to the company that bore his name, tried personally to keep it alive. In 1933, working with near-nothing resources, his engineers produced the Willys 77. A genuinely fresh, streamlined design with a sloping hood, swept-back grille, and integrated headlamps, years ahead of what Detroit would acknowledge as streamlining. The car was received well. The sales were modest, but it proved the factory could still build something worth buying. John North Willys died on August 26, 1935. He was 61 years old. The man who had rescued Overland from bankruptcy in 1907 built it into the second largest car maker in America, lost it, rebuilt it, lost it again, and returned a final time to fight for it, was gone. What came after him would be something entirely different. Something built not on his energy or his vision, but on the desperate ingenuity of men who had nothing left to lose, and one small vehicle that would change the world. 1940, Toledo, Ohio, Joseph W. Fraser had joined Willys-Overland from Chrysler in 1938 as chief executive, walking into a company still clawing its way out of the Depression's grip. The factory was running but fragile. The workforce was a fraction of its former size. The models being produced were competent but unremarkable. Nobody in the boardroom was celebrating. Then, on June 27, 1940, the United States Army sent an invitation to 135 American automobile manufacturers. The Army needed something specific: a quarter-ton, four-wheel-drive light reconnaissance vehicle, capable of carrying 3 men and a machine gun mount across any terrain. Weight had to be kept under 1,275 pounds, and the Army wanted a prototype delivered in just 49 days. 132 companies ignored the request. Only 3 responded: American Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania, Willys-Overland of Toledo, Ohio, and the Ford Motor Company. Willys-Overland's entry was built around an engine redesigned from the ground up by Delmar Barney Rouse, the former chief engineer from Studebaker, whom Fraser had brought in precisely for this kind of challenge. Rouse's original assignment had been brutal: take a 4-cylinder engine that produced 48 horsepower at 3,400 revolutions per minute and could run continuously for only 2 to 4 hours before failing, and rebuild it into something that could produce 60 horsepower at 4,400 revolutions per minute and run for 150 hours without failure. He achieved it through closer tolerances, tougher metal alloys, aluminum pistons, and a flywheel reduced from 57 pounds to 31. The result was the L134 engine. The soldiers who drove the prototype called it the Go Devil. Willys delivered its vehicle, named the Quad, to Army testers at Camp Holabird, Maryland, on Armistice Day, November 11, 1940. The design was completed in 75 days. Only 2 prototypes were built. On July 15, 1941, Willys-Overland signed a contract with the United States Army to produce 16,000 vehicles at a unit price of $738.74. The vehicle had no formal name yet. A test driver named Irving "Red" Houseman, asked what the strange little machine was called, answered without thinking, "Why, I call it a Jeep. Everybody does." The factory on Jeep Parkway would never be the same again. 1943, Toledo, Ohio. The factory had been transformed into something unrecognizable from the Depression-era shell it had been just 7 years earlier. Every building was alive. The 3 great Overland smokestacks burned hot around the clock. Banners across the main entrance read, "Our job is our firing line." A banner was not hyperbole. It was a statement of daily reality. At peak production, a completed Willys MB Jeep rolled off the Toledo assembly line every 80 seconds. If 15,000 workers ran the plant in shifts, women who had been hired into clerical roles were now operating stamping presses and running quality assessments on completed vehicles. By the end of the war, some had been promoted to plant supervisors. The Army and Navy jointly awarded Willys-Overland the E Pennant for Production Excellence, one of the highest commendations an American manufacturer could receive during wartime. The numbers from those years are staggering. By the end of the Second World War in 1945, Willys-Overland had produced 362,841 military Jeeps. Ford, working from Willys' own blueprints and engine specifications under government order, added another 280,448. American Bantam, the original designer of the concept, was permitted only 2,675. Before the contract was shifted entirely to the larger manufacturers. The Jeep served in every theater of the war. It crossed North African desert and European mud. It climbed the Italian mountains and the Pacific Islands. It was used as an ambulance, a command vehicle, a communications platform, a weapons carrier, and a supply runner. General Dwight Eisenhower would later list it among the decisive tools of Allied victory. General Marshall had already called it America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. On February 13, 1943, Willys-Overland filed a trademark application for the word Jeep with the United States Patent Office. After years of challenges from Ford and Bantam, the trademark was finally awarded to the company on June 13, 1950. The word the factory had given to the world was now, legally, theirs. But here's what the executives celebrating in Toledo in 1945 could not see, or would not see. The war was ending. The military contracts would wind down. The 15,000 workers would need new work. And the question of what Willys-Overland would become in peacetime, a question they had deferred for 4 years, could be deferred no longer. 1945. Toledo, Ohio. The decision not to return to passenger cars was made quietly, without the fanfare of a major announcement. The executives at Willys-Overland had simply looked at the competitive landscape. The big 3 of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were returning to peacetime production with enormous resources and established dealer networks, and concluded that fighting for a slice of the mainstream automobile market would be an expensive, probably futile battle. The decision had logic to it, and it had consequences that nobody fully understood at the time. Yet the first civilian product introduced in 1945 was the CJ2A, a stripped-down version of the wartime MB with the military blackout lighting removed, and a civilian tailgate added. Ward Canaday, still running the company, envisioned the CJ2A primarily as a farm vehicle. Willys-Overland Marketing branded it the all-around farm workhorse. Claiming it could do the work of two heavy draft horses at 4 miles per hour for 10 hours straight without overheating. The sales pitch was directed at the estimated 5.5 million American farmers who owned neither a truck nor a tractor. It was a reasonable idea on paper. Farm equipment had been out of production during the war. Tractors were in short supply. A nimble, four-wheel drive vehicle with a power takeoff unit could theoretically serve agricultural purposes that dedicated farm machinery would address better and more powerfully. The Agri-Jeep, as this concept was sometimes called, it never fully materialized. The CJ2A was simply too light to provide the pulling force that genuine farm work demanded. Farmers who tried to use it as a tractor substitute found it insufficient. Sales were modest, not transformative. Then something happened that nobody had planned for. The veterans came home. Hundreds of thousands of men who had driven Jeeps across the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific returned to civilian life carrying a visceral affection for the vehicle. They didn't want a farm tool. They wanted the freedom they associated with the open cockpit and the four-wheel drive that had taken them places no road had ever gone. In 1946, Willys added the all-steel Jeep utility wagon, America's first all-steel station wagon, with seating for 7 and cargo capacity over 1,000 pounds. In 1947, a Jeep pickup truck followed. By 1948, both were available with four-wheel drive, making them the ancestors of every sport utility vehicle that would be built for the next 80 years. The product line was expanding, the market was finding them. But the company itself was running out of time to find itself. 1952, Toledo, Ohio. The factory floor had quieted since the war years. Not silent. Production continued. The CJ series sold consistently. The wagons and trucks moved through dealers. But the frantic, electric urgency of wartime production was gone. The workforce had contracted from 15,000 to something closer to 6,000. The administration building across Jeep Parkway still stood, the same limestone and brick structure that John North Willys had built in 1915 and declared a symbol of permanence. But the name on the roof had changed. The Willys-Overland Company sign was being quietly replaced with smaller corporate logos. Into this ambiguous moment came what appeared to be a bold move. In 1952, Willys-Overland re-entered the passenger car market after a 7-year absence with the Willys Aero, a compact, stylish two-door sedan available with either an L-head or F-head 6-cylinder engine. The bodies were supplied by the Murray Body Corporation. The Aero cars were branded with aspirational names: Lark, Wing, Falcon, Ace, Eagle. A 4-door sedan and a 2-door hardtop followed in 1953, along with taxi models for commercial operators. The Aero was, by the standards of the day, a genuinely competent small car. It was well-proportioned, reasonably priced, and offered features that compared favorably with competition from the independent manufacturers. But re-entering the passenger car market in 1952 meant competing directly with General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, companies whose design budgets, dealer networks, and advertising power dwarfed anything Willys-Overland could mobilize. The Aero never found the volume it needed. Meanwhile, the Jeep CJ3B had entered production in 1952. By 1968, more than 155,000 units would be sold. The CJ5 would debut in 1954 on a 30-year production run that would eventually reach 600,000 vehicles. The off-road line was the company's genuine strength. Everyone could see it. Everyone but the executives making strategic decisions. The problem was that Willys-Overland was caught between two identities. It was either a utility vehicle specialist, a niche manufacturer with a devoted customer base, or a mainstream automobile company competing in the most expensive arena in American industry. It could not successfully be both, and it could not afford to pick the wrong one. Then came a phone call from Henry J. Kaiser, and the choice was made for them. We're halfway through this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything and keeps this channel alive. What happens next with Kaiser is one of the most fascinating corporate decisions in American automotive history. Stay with us. 28th of February, 1953. New York City. The front page of the business section of the New York Times carried an unusual item that morning. Someone on the Willys-Overland board of directors had leaked word of secret merger negotiations between Willys and the struggling Kaiser Fraser Corporation. Ward Canaday, chairman of Willys-Overland, publicly denied everything. Various individuals have approached us in the past few years. At this time, there is no proposal before us. It was a denial that lasted less than a month. On March 24, 1953, the Toledo Blade reported on its front page that Canaday was selling the assets of Willys-Overland to Kaiser Fraser, subject to shareholder approval. On April 28, 1953, Kaiser Fraser Corporation acquired Willys-Overland in a deal valued at approximately $63,381,000. The shareholder vote in favor, 98%. The meeting was brief. Only 29 stockholders attended in person. The financial logic, as explained by the New York Herald Tribune's financial editor Donald Rogers, was labyrinthine. Kaiser Fraser was technically a money-losing company being kept alive through $48 million in government loans and $31 million in tax credit carry-forwards. Willys-Overland was a profitable company making a clean, steady income from Jeep production. The acquisition had less to do with automotive synergy than with Kaiser's ability to use Willys' profitable operations to offset its own staggering losses through tax accounting. Henry J. Kaiser's son, Edgar Kaiser, understood clearly that the Jeep brand was the crown jewel in the transaction. Kaiser Fraser renamed the combined entity Willys Motors, Incorporated. By late 1953 and through 1954, Kaiser's Willow Run, Michigan plant was closed and sold to General Motors. The giant Kaiser plant that had once produced over 300,000 Kaiser and Fraser cars was shuttered, and its operations consolidated into Toledo. The result was that two failing passenger car lines, Kaiser and Willys Aero, were now being produced on the same Toledo assembly line, alongside the one product that actually had a future, the Jeep. By 1955, Kaiser acknowledged the obvious. The all-passenger car production, Kaiser, Willys Aero, every consumer sedan, ceased in the American market. The tooling for the Aero was shipped to Brazil. The Kaiser dies went to Argentina. What was left in Toledo was the Jeep, stripped clean of everything else, focused, alive. But a company built on someone else's money, rescued through tax tricks, and stripped of its original identity is not a company that can afford bold decisions. And bold decisions were exactly what the next decade demanded. 1957, Toledo, Ohio. To be fair to Kaiser's management, they did several things at Willys that the old Willys-Overland company had never managed. They rationalized the product line. They invested in new models. They introduced the forward control FC-150 in 1956, a cab-forward pickup truck on the CJ5 chassis that maximized cargo space with a striking, modern design. The FC-170 followed in 1957 with a longer wheelbase and greater capability. Then came the Wagoneer. Introduced as a 1963 model, the Jeep Wagoneer was the design work of industrial designer Brooks Stevens, a vehicle that would remain in production largely unchanged for nearly 30 years. The Wagoneer combined genuine four-wheel drive capability with unprecedented interior comfort, optional automatic transmission, and an enclosed, family-usable body. How it is today recognized by automotive historians as arguably the first true sport utility vehicle in the modern sense. It was the direct spiritual ancestor of the Jeep Grand Cherokee, the Ford Explorer, the Chevrolet Tahoe, of an entire industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually. The original Jeep Gladiator full-sized pickup truck was introduced the same year, also designed by Brooks Stevens. By any reasonable measure, was Willys Motors, now operating under Kaiser management, was innovating aggressively. But here is where the fatal flaw in Kaiser's ownership reveals itself. Kaiser Industries, the sprawling holding company controlled by the Kaiser family, was not fundamentally an automobile company. It was an industrial conglomerate with interests in steel, aluminum, engineering, and real estate. The automobile division, the Jeep operation in Toledo, was a profitable subsidiary, but it was not the heart of the enterprise. Decisions made in Toledo were filtered through a hierarchy that had other priorities. In 1963, Kaiser stripped away the last vestige of the name that had built the factory. The company was renamed Kaiser Jeep Corporation. The Willys name, the name of the man who had rescued the original Overland company in 1907, the name that had graced the second largest automaker in America, the name of the company that had built the Jeep that helped win the Second World War, disappeared from the American market entirely. A name, some would say, is just a name, but a name is also a story. And when a company erases its own story, it often loses something it cannot define until it is irretrievably gone. By 1969, Kaiser Industries made its decision clear. It was getting out of the automobile business entirely. 1970, Toledo, Ohio. The Jeep Corporation, the once Willys-Overland, once Kaiser Jeep, was sold in 1970 to American Motors Corporation, AMC. The last surviving independent American automobile manufacturer, Kaiser received a 22% interest in AMC as part of the transaction. Toledo gained a new corporate owner. The factory kept running. Under AMC, the product line actually improved in important ways. AMC brought its own 6-cylinder and V8 engines to the Jeep lineup, replacing the aging Jeep power plants with modern, better-performing units. The CJ series continued selling. The Wagoneer, now called the Grand Wagoneer, found a growing luxury market. Production at the Toledo plant, though smaller than its wartime peak, remained active and employed thousands. But AMC was itself a company in trouble. By 1979, the French automaker Renault had purchased a major stake in AMC and taken effective operational control. Yet Renault brought European engineering philosophies and a European perspective on fuel efficiency to an American company whose strongest product was a collection of fuel-hungry four-wheel drive utility vehicles. The CJ series continued. The CJ5 had been in production since 1954, but Renault's influence over AMC's direction was pulling the company toward front-wheel drive compact cars that had nothing to do with the Jeep legacy. Meanwhile, the factory itself was aging. It's the buildings on Jeep Parkway, sighing and dated to the turn of the 20th century. The administration building that John Willys had built in 1915, the one he had called a symbol of permanence, had sat empty for 5 years. By 1979, American Motors Corporation determined it was obsolete, too expensive to heat, impossible to sell, impossible to give away. On April 14, 1979, an estimated 4,000 people gathered along Interstate 75 to watch the building implode. The limestone and brick monument John Willys had built to declare his company's permanence collapsed in seconds, raising a cloud of dust over the Ottawa River. Some of the decorative banisters were moved across the street to the Jeep House Museum before the implosion. Most of the building simply ceased to exist. In 1987, Chrysler Corporation purchased AMC entirely. Lock, stock, and everything that had been Willys-Overland. The factory on Jeep Parkway became the Toledo assembly plant. The CJ series had already been replaced by the Jeep Wrangler in 1986. The last connection to the civilian Jeep lineage that John Willys' engineers had launched in 1945 was now a vehicle wearing a different name, built by a corporation formed 15 years after Willys-Overland had ceased to exist. The chain of ownership had stretched to its breaking point, and the original factory was beginning its final act. 2001, Jeep Parkway, Toledo, Ohio. After more than 60 years of building Jeeps on the same grounds where John North Willys had consolidated his operations in 1910, DaimlerChrysler, the German-American automotive giant that had absorbed Chrysler in 1998, opened a new assembly facility 2 miles north along Interstate 75. Modern, efficient, clean, built for the Jeep Liberty, the new unibody crossover that the company's designers had concluded was the future of the brand. The old Parkway plant, the one with the Overland smokestacks that had been a Toledo landmark since 1915, the one where 15,000 workers had once built one Jeep every 80 seconds, was no longer needed for full production. In 1993, it had been assigned to assemble and paint the Jeep Cherokee and later the Jeep Wrangler, with final assembly happening at the adjacent Stickney plant. But the scale of what it had once been was a memory now, visible only in the vast, emptying square footage of 60 buildings spread across a factory complex that no modern operation required. In 2002, demolition began. 1/3 of the plant went first. Buildings that had housed research departments, the Jeep House Museum, the original Ford shop. A 16,500-pound wrecking ball worked through concrete and steel that had been poured, in some cases before the First World War. Ron Szymanski, curator of the Jeep House Museum and the most devoted chronicler of the plant's history, walked through the remaining structures in January of 2002 with the plant videographer, photographing whatever remained. Documents from the 1950s. Prototype records. Saw engineering drawings for vehicles that had never gone into production. DaimlerChrysler, he reported, was not particularly interested in preserving any of it. On June 26, 2006, the Associated Press reported that the last painted Wrangler body had rolled off the Parkway assembly line. The plant that had been the oldest continuously operating automobile factory in the United States was closing. 2 of the 3 Overland smokestacks were demolished on June 18th, 2007. The third was preserved and dedicated as a monument in August of 2013, a single brick stack, alone in an industrial park, redeveloped for warehouses and distribution centers, with the letters O-V-E-R-L-A-N-D spelled out in darker brick, visible to the estimated 125,000 motorists who passed along Interstate 75 every day. Most of them did not know what they were looking at. Today, Shetty, if you stand along Interstate 75 in Toledo and look east toward the Ottawa River, you will find an industrial park where 60 buildings once stood, warehouses, distribution centers, a concrete landscape with no particular story to tell, except for one thing, one surviving smokestack rising against the Ohio sky with the word Overland written in bricks, dark against light. The only physical monument left to everything that happened on this ground. If you look at it long enough, the whole history comes back. The story of Willys-Overland is not primarily a story about the Jeep, though the Jeep is its most famous chapter. It is a story about the decisions that surround greatness, the ones made when a founder's energy is misread as institutional momentum, the ones made when crisis reveals that the people running a company are managing it rather than leading it. The ones made when a corporation's identity becomes so blurred that it cannot answer the simplest question. What are we exactly? 3 lessons echo across a century of this company's history. The first is that a founder is not replaceable by a system. John North Willys was Willys-Overland in a way that no organizational chart could replicate. When he moved to New York in 1918, he did not delegate his authority. He abandoned his presence. The strike of 1919, the receivership of 1921, the Depression collapse of the 30s, each crisis was, at its root, a crisis of direction. The factory could run without him. The company could not. The second is that the decision not to return to passenger cars after the war was both brilliant and fatal. It was brilliant because it was honest. Willys could not compete with the big three for the mainstream buyer. Yes, it was fatal because it left the company entirely dependent on a specialized market, utility vehicles and military contracts, that could be absorbed, acquired, or redirected by anyone with enough capital. A company with one product is not a company with a strength. It is a company with a target. The third is that ownership matters more than branding. The Jeep survived. The name survived. The vehicle survived, passed from Kaiser to AMC, to Renault, to Chrysler, to DaimlerChrysler, to Stellantis. What did not survive was the original company. The factory on Jeep Parkway was demolished. The administration building was imploded. The Willys name disappeared in 1963. From 1908 to 1963, 55 years of operation. Peak employment, 15,000 workers in Toledo alone. Peak production, one Jeep every 80 seconds in wartime. Final chapter, a corporate name change, a Brazilian export, and a wrecking ball. She means that smokestack still stands along Interstate 75. It does not say Jeep. It does not say Kaiser. It does not say Chrysler or Stellantis. It says Overland, the name from before the beginning. A remnant of a company that built itself from a bankrupt Indianapolis factory and ended as a parking lot and an industrial park, with the word its founder discarded more than a century ago still spelling itself out in dark brick for anyone patient enough to read it.